Hey, let's get back to our study of the Apology. Uh, Today, we'll finally get to the reason Socrates is actually in court. We'll get to the charges that have been brought up against him. So I'm going to look at 20 Apology 24b to 28b, which is where he has a direct engagement with the charges that Melitus has brought, and he has a little dialogue, so to speak, a little set of exchanges with Melitus. Um, but uh, but just to get into that, I want to go a little bit before that to 23 B, I guess, or sorry, 23C, and after that, when he talks about the young people that have bon following him, and so on, and he says, the children of rich people have sometimes followed me because they're rich, they have the time to do that, and they like watching me cross-examine people, and some of them have taken up that practice themselves. Um, and he says, it's relatively easy for them to find people who don't know what they're talking about, and so this practice has developed of these people um, um, examining others and I guess making them feel sort of dumb. So he says, thereupon, those examined by them, by the young people who imitate him, are angry at me, not at themselves. First of all, this is a kind of important point to notice, just to think about the nature of anger. Um, what's presumably really happening is that people are, in fact, demonstrating in conversation that they don't know what they're talking about. So he says they get angry at me, though, for teaching the young to do that, not at themselves. But anger, when we get angry, we often get mad at people um, because they have shown something about us. Like, it could just be a simple matter of criticism. Someone criticizes you for doing something wrong, and they might be right. But if you did something wrong, what you'd hope is that you'd say, "Oh, I was at fault, and I should change that." But and so of course, sometimes people respond that way, but it's very commonly not our reaction. It's very commonly the case that we get mad at someone for criticizing us. Right? And similarly here, somebody shows you up to not know something, we get mad at them for having shown us up not to know something. Right? So it's very interesting to think about the anger in particular, the way we use our anger, the often unjust way we use our anger, and the way that the target of our anger is often not very well matched with where the actual failing is. And by saying that, I don't mean to suggest that there could be no reason for being angry at these young people, but I think Socrates' remark is actually pointing to something pretty important about the way uh, anger is something we often rely on to do bad things. Um, and and here he's talking about the thing the young people do, but he says, before this, in all these other situations, I did things and people started to hate me. So there's a lot of talk about hatred and anger in here, um, to me, it seems pretty significant and correctly revelatory of the injustices we often perform to those names, in our hatreds and angers. But anyway, so he says, thereupon those examined by them are angry at me, not at themselves, and they say that Socrates is someone most disgusting and that he corrupts the young. Right. So some young people ask these other people questions. Those other people are show themselves not to know what they're talking about, and so they say Socrates is at fault. And what's he at fault for? Well, he taught them how to do that. Now, as he said, he was never a paid educator. He never told these people to do it. They have imitated him and done things. So you should already think right there, like, just at the level of causality, is their causal claim correct? Socrates is doing something to those people. Maybe you think it is, but maybe not. Um, but but there's that. There's the question of the causal claim. There's the question of, yes, even if that causal claim is there, how should we judge what those people are doing? And there's the question of how we should judge the reaction people have to them. There's a whole set of different issues here, at least those three, that are built into the the response people are having to Socrates. They're blaming him. They're mad at him because they blame him for corrupting the youth. Are they right to be mad? Are they right to blame? And is what he does corruption? And you could possibly answer no to all those things. You could possibly answer yes too, but in any case, so they say that Socrates is someone most disgusting and that he corrupts the young. But then if somebody asks them, so now here he's saying here's where one of these claims starts to come from. If that's what they say, that's what they get mad about. And so if someone asks those people, well, by doing what and by teaching what, how did he corrupt them? How did he do this? Then they have nothing to say. He says they're ignorant again. So there again, you see that very structure of people asserting something without really knowing what they're saying, right? That's the very structure he's been talking about. But in any case, that happens here. He says, by doing what and saying what, they have nothing to say. So in order not to seem at a loss, they say the things that are ready to hand against all who philosophize. My point I was making earlier. They say this thing about the things aloft and under the earth, not believing the gods, making the weaker argument the stronger, right? So as he says, those are the things that are ready to hand to say against all who philosophize. So that there, he's now giving you his ultimate answer to where those charges came from, right? And then he says, a little bit later, he says the people who say these things are ambitious, zealous, and many. They speak in an organized and persuasive way. They've slandered me for a long time. And among these men, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon attacked me, right? The people who made this charge against him. So there's his answer to, where the culmination of his answer to where the old charges come from, which we were talking about last time. But and then he's saying, and that's where Melitus comes from, right? That he is coming out of that. But Melitus doesn't make the old charges, right? I mean, that is to say, he hasn't brought him to court officially saying Socrates studies the things under the earth and in the heavens and so on. He's saying, those are the old charges. But so he says, 24b. So against Melitus and these new accusers, the later accusers, I will try to speak next in my defense. And so now we're going to hear the charge. But notice he says, now again, just as though these other accusers, let me take up their sworn statement. So remember when he said, there are these old charges. He said, there are these rumors that circulate and so on, but so nobody ever actually comes out and makes a case that says, Socrates, you're guilty of this. But there's this whole reputation that develops. And so he said, well, let's put it in the form of a charge. Right? Even though there's no one you can point to who is saying that thing, you can then cross-examine and so on. He put it in that form. So he said, well, here's the charge. Socrates studies the things under the earth and the heavens, etc., etc. Well, now he's going to do that with Melitus. But the thing to notice here is there is a person making that exact charge here. So I want you to think about the difference between those two things, between the kinds of claims that circulate at the level of popular reputation, kinds of negative claims or positive. Here we're thinking negative. And the kinds of claims that a particular individual makes in a law court. So Socrates has already drawn our attention to the problems or the sort of limitations of the gossipy one, right? That nobody's straightforwardly made that claim. You don't even really remember where you learned it because it sort of was fed into you when you were a kid. You can't call forward a single individual and cross-examine them. So there is no one who's taking responsibility for those claims, right? So in court, all those things are different, right? In court, some individual has said, I assert that blah, blah, blah. So there is a particular person making a particular claim. And the job of the court is to assess whether that claim is convincing, compelling or not. And so the individual making that claim is basically responsible for saying something coherent and true, right? The charge has to make sense, and there has to be evidence to support it, right? And it's the court's job to make that be the case, right? So here a person is saying something, and so there is a person who should be answerable to the implications of what, in this case, he has said. Um, so I guess I want you to think there about, we started off at the very beginning with the notion of language, right? When he says, I don't even remember, I almost forgot myself, so persuasively did they speak, and so on. We talked a little bit about that. I just want you to keep thinking about the nature of language and think about what is at stake when you assert something. Now, one of the things we've seen about Socrates' whole examination of other people, the politicians, the poets, and the craftspeople, is that those people make claims they can't really defend. They claim to know things, they claim to believe things that they ultimately show that they don't know what they're talking about. They don't have the evidence for it. Their views aren't even coherent, whatever it is. So we know that's the thing people do. Well, so now you have someone who's in that situation of Melitus making an explicit accusation. Socrates, this is who you are. This is what you do. And I think you should be killed because of it. It's a pretty serious accusation. And so now we're going to encounter, Socrates, I guess everybody's going to encounter in full force those two issues I've just mentioned. On the one hand, this individual is answerable for his claims. So how, in a way that a rumor is not, the spreading of a rumor doesn't fit that. So we're going to see how that gets handled. And secondly, the person who, hope this person knows what he's talking about if he's making such a serious claim. Well, we're going to see that issue again of whether or not somebody knows what he's talking about. So the point I'm trying to get at there, I guess it's got just two little points, two little heads to it. On the one hand, I want you to be thinking about the nature of those issues in general to see what's at stake. And I also want you to see how those themes we've already talked about are both sort of should orient how we think about what's happening right here. And so he says that, so let's take up their sworn statement. He says it's something like this. It asserts that Socrates does injustice by corrupting the young and by not believing in the gods in whom the city believes, but in other daimonia that are novel. So the translators kept the Greek word in there, which is fine for good reason. But it'd be nice to have an English word just so you know what the charge actually means. Maybe you could put the word spirits in there. Socrates corrupts the young. He doesn't believe in the gods, but he believes in other spirits that are new that he's introducing into the city. So he says that's basically the charge. Let's examine it. So he corrupts the young. He doesn't believe in the gods, and he's introducing new spirits, right? Which is to say, he's encouraging kind of religious beliefs that are at odds with the beliefs of the city. Sometimes people translate that divinities. I said spirits. But I guess the word divinities helps to notice the direct paralleling of the issue of not believing in the gods of the city.
And bringing in new divinities.
We're going to talk about each of those in turn. Let's talk about so first he talks about the first one. Socrates corrupts the young. And he says, he's going to go on to say that this is something that Melitus has never paid any attention to. Well, actually, here's what he actually says here. He says, I assert that Melitus is the one who's doing an injustice here because he jests in a serious matter, easily bringing human beings to trial, pretending to be serious and concerned about things for which he never cared at all. So the first thing he's saying is, well, let's take that last remark. He doesn't care about these things. And so the charge, any kind of charge like that, is sort of based on the presumption that since you're mad about this, it must be something you care about, right? So Socrates is saying, no, he's never cared about these things. These issues he's raising, the fact that he's raising it reveals a certain lack of honesty in himself. He's taking a stand on values that he doesn't take a stand on, and so that's the substantive claim behind this, right? And so like if I go read a newspaper article on research in contemporary physics, and then go to take somebody to court because I say you're not doing the important things in physics, you would say, like, you got no business being here. You don't know anything about physics. You're not in a position to go accusing people of wrongdoing on these things because you don't know anything about that field. You've never had any involvement with it. That's kind of the same thing Socrates is saying here. Melitus is, making the kind of claim that someone can make who is actually involved with something and cares about something, but he doesn't. But Socrates says he's not that person. We're going to look more at that in a second. I just want to read refer to the other part of the thing he says. He says, related to that, then, that Melitus is jesting in a serious matter, easily bringing human beings to trial. So, yeah, it's one thing to accuse people about things that you don't actually have, that you've actually never taken seriously. If you're just walking around saying, "Oh, that guy doesn't know about physics," or whatever. Somebody else takes somebody to court. He's taking Socrates, a human being, to trial. So you also want to think about what's at stake there, which has big issues in it, and what it should make you think about what a law court is, what laws are for, what courts are for, and also what your responsibilities are in dealing with other people and in dealing with your own anger about other people. So you might ask yourself, if you get mad at someone, when is it right to call the police on them? This isn't quite the same as calling the police, but it's similar. I mean, it's a similar kind of structure. It's like bringing in the state to settle an issue. And it seems like you should bring it. I think the correct thing to say is you should bring in the state when it's an issue the state should be concerned with. Right? But there's something wrong with trying to use the state to settle your petty, especially dishonest grievances. So, if you dislike someone, you can call the cops on them, even though they've done absolutely nothing, just because you think, oh, well, that might get the person in some trouble. That wouldn't be a very nice thing to do. But even if you're a bit more earnest and you're angry about something, you need to think, what's the weight of calling in the police, and what am I doing to another person's life by doing that? And that's a thing that should be taken seriously. Well, so his point is then, both at the level of the issues he's making claims about and at the level of the means he's using to address that. Socrates is saying about Melitus that at both those levels, Melitus is doing something wrong. He's wrong to make the kinds of accusations he's making, and he's wrong to try to use the power of the state to address his grumpiness. So that's just sort of the opening context. Well, okay, now let's see the claims though. So he takes up the claim that Socrates corrupts the youth, and so he says, let's talk about your views about the youth. He says, do you regard it as most important how the youth will be the best possible? Melitus says, I do, and that's where Socrates is going to say, you never thought about this for a minute in your life. Melitus gives a series of answers. I'm going to go through them quickly to first get to Socrates' point, and then go back and look at a couple of his answers a little bit. So he says, Socrates says, tell me, who makes them better? And Melitus says, the laws. And Socrates says, well, okay, I'm not asking you what makes them better. I'm asking who. You're accusing me of corrupting. So let's think about the people who are actually making them better. And then Socrates says, so who? And so he says, oh, these men, all these judges, they're the one who makes people. These are the ones who make people better. And Socrates says, all of them? Are they the ones who educate the young and make them better? And Melitus says, oh, yes, all of them. And he says, oh, and what about the listeners in the audience too? Do they make them better too? And he says, oh, yes, all of them. And then he sort of goes through, and the councilmen, yes, yes. The people in the assembly, yes, yes. Oh, all the Athenians, yes, yes. So he says, so basically, he asks Melitus a series of questions, and it's hard not to get the impression when you read this that Melitus is not taking the conversation seriously. Like he's just saying, I hate you, Socrates, I hate you, Socrates, I hate you, Socrates, I hate you, Socrates. And so when Socrates asks him, okay, who makes them better? Melitus grabs for an answer, but it's not a well thought out answer. And so when Socrates pushes him farther, Melitus just makes his answer ultimately kind of more and more ridiculous. So Melitus effectively ends up saying, my view, Socrates, is that everybody else is great. Everybody else is making children excellent, except you, and at that point, it doesn't sound very plausible. And it seems to me, it sounds pretty much like Socrates says, that Melitus doesn't have serious views about this. He's expressing his anger, but he has never really thought about what it takes to make a person better and who does it or who doesn't do it. Pause. A couple other points about that. Going back to this earlier issue about how Melitus and his charges relate to the themes from the earlier part of the dialogue. Well, there then you see a person being called upon to stand up for his claims, right? It's an accusation, and he's being called upon to defend it. And you see whether this person is making claims where he knows what he's talking about or not. Here, it seems like this is someone who, like those people Socrates spoke about before, who purport to be wise but show they don't know what they're talking about. Here, Melitus has made a claim, and it starts to look like he doesn't know what he's talking about. So in this tiny little exchange, it seems like Socrates has done exactly the thing he's always done. And so he's sort of putting on display his normal practice. And it does indeed seem like Melitus doesn't really know what he's talking about. He makes claims that he can't back up. Which is an issue anywhere. But again, now bring it back to the other point. This is also an issue in a law court, right? So this is an accusation that has to be defended by that person. So it actually matters. It should matter to the court whether Melitus can back up this accusation he's made or not. So keep that thought in mind. Anyway, okay. But so yeah, so Socrates says, you're making it clear that what you say, through what you say, you're making clear you don't know what you're talking about. And you've never taken this seriously. But let's look at the particular thing he says at the end. So this is at 25A and B. He says, answer me this. Does the thing you've just said, where everybody makes them better except me, I make them worse, does that seem to be true also concerning horses? Is it the case that all horses would make them better, but one certain one would corrupt them? He says, no, it's the exact opposite of that. He says, well, he puts it in the form of a question, or is it the opposite? That one certain one is able to make them better, or, a few, those who are skilled at training horses. While the many, if they were to associate with horses and use them, would break them, would corrupt them. Is this not so, Melitus, both concerning horses and other animals? I'll just remind you that he raised that issue once before. I wonder if I wrote down where. Yeah, 28 to B. It's the way he got into his discussion of whether he's a teacher or not, right? And then talking about his own autobiography. He says once he was talking to this guy Callias. So he says, you're accusing me of being one of those sophists, one of those guys who goes around teaching. And he says he's not, but he tells you about a little conversation he had with Callias. And he says Callias is a guy who spent a lot of money to hire people to teach his sons. And he says he talks there about if this is at 28, if your two sons had been born colts or calves, we could have hired an overseer for them who could make the two of them noble and good. And he says, so who do you get? Who have you hired someone who can do that for your children who are humans? And that's when he says, yes, I hired this guy, even as a Paros. Um, uh, um, the relevant thing then that I want you to think about there, and that Socrates wants you to think about there in the exchange with Melitus, is that to if you're going to teach someone, if you're going to get someone to be better, you really have to be basically kind of an expert in that kind of thing. Like you have to learn, you have to become an expert in horses to know what to do to help a horse develop its potential and how to interact with it in such a way as not to hurt it. Which is why you don't let your 4-year-old son decide what to feed the cats or to feed the dog, right? You can't just give it any old thing you want. You have to give it a proper diet, and you also probably don't know what the proper diet for your dog or cat is. Maybe you do, but more likely the vet does, and you just buy the food the vet specifies because the vet is an expert, right? So even just at the level of feeding, it's pretty clear you need the experts, right? And part of the point Socrates is making in that earlier exchange with Callias is the issue, as significant an issue as that is with respect to training horses, the issue is even more complex with the question of making people good. Who are you going to pick to make your children good, and how do you do it? And part of the issue there is, and the thing you should be thinking about is it's not so clear how to do that. And if you let's leave it there. It's not so clear how to do that. But anyway, his point here is, it's if you look at what it takes to get something to develop its potential, it's not the case that it's just easy and automatic, right? It's the people who can do that are people who really know what they're doing. Right? And so he says, so what do you think if you compare it to horses? He says this to Melitus. What do you think if you compare it to horses? Like everybody makes them great, but one person wrecks them, or a small number of people can make them great, and most people would probably damage them. So we asked Melitus that question, and Melitus doesn't answer, right? So this is at 25b. He said that. He says, "Is this not so, Melitus, both concerning horses and all other animals?" And then you look for Melitus's response. There's no response there from Melitus. Socrates says, "Of course it is the way I've said, altogether so, whether you and Anytus deny or affirm it." And then a little bit later he says, "But tell us further, Melitus, whether it's better to dwell among upright sitters or villainous ones." And he says, "Sir, answer, for surely I'm asking nothing hard." Now, the thing I want you to notice there is that Melitus is not answering. Like he went to court and he brought this charge in. When you go to court, going back to the claim I was making about the difference between a person making an accusation in court and a reputation that circulates. If you're going to go to court and make an accusation, then you have bound yourself to that issue of being answerable to what you've said and having to defend those things. So maybe you don't like the way Socrates talks to people outside, that's fine, but in the court, the very meaning of what's going on in the court is that your claim has to be open to examination, or you have to be open to cross-examination. So if Melitus is unwilling to answer, that's not okay. It's not okay to make a charge against someone, to call for that person's death, and not hold yourself answerable to defending the legitimacy of the things that you've said. And so Socrates is trying to talk to him, and he just won't do it. And through this exchange, that happens a few times that Melitus won't answer, and Socrates has to call upon the court to say, like, make this guy answer. And so I want you to think about that and to think about what Melitus is displaying through his behavior. Right? Okay, so that's the run through of the basic thing there that happens with Socrates examination of Melitus's claim about corruption, he asks him to answer it. Melitus gives these answers that seem to show that he doesn't really care about it and he won't answer and so on. Before moving on, though, I want to pause and look at a couple of his answers. So it seems to me, on the one hand, pretty clear that Socrates is right. Melitus doesn't care about these things, and his answers are pretty thoughtless. So Melitus, the accuser, it seems to me, can't justify his charge against Socrates, etc. But that doesn't mean no one could. That doesn't mean there's nothing sensible about it. And Melitus's answers don't seem very smart, but that doesn't mean there's nothing in them. So I want to just look at a couple of them. So his first answer, he says, what makes them better? And Melitus says the laws. I mean, why does he say that? I mean, maybe he's just almost threatening Socrates, like, you're bad. What we're doing here is good. We got the law, Maybe he's doing something like that. I don't know why he says the laws. I don't know why he says the laws, but probably something like that. But it's a kind of an interesting idea that the laws might be part of something significant that educates people. If you go back to our discussions about the Athenian and the Spartan constitution, right? Those lawmakers, Solon and Lycurgus, or whoever, would try, or the whole idea of human law and the self-regulating community that we were talking about. The idea there was that people are trying to produce a better human world by the way they make those laws. And we commonly think about laws as regulating behavior, but you can also think of them as, in a deeper way, as personally formative, right? They're providing the context into which we grow up, and that in maybe in a certain way is trying to shape who we are. I mean, that's really evident in the Spartan constitution, where they're really trying to make people be great, strong soldiers by the kind of laws they have, right? And so, and their laws, in some ways seem to work at that. But you might not imagine that's the greatest goal, that people should be soldiers, right? So you can think, okay, what is it that Athens cultivates by the kinds of laws and things they have? So something quite different. Well, regardless of what you think about those two places, this issue in general, that laws might be more than just regulating behavior, that they might have to do with education, with shaping how we become people. That's a pretty powerful and interesting idea. I don't think Melitus, he doesn't give any evidence that he has any thoughts about that, but it's a thing worth thinking about. And then the juryman, the councilman, the assemblyman that I mentioned there, I guess those are sort of sub branches of that answer I just gave. Like, how you set up the city might have something significant to do with how people are formed. And so setting up a city like Athens, with its laws, its structure of the council and the assembly, and its structure of the law courts, like, that is the environment that's being set up into which people are growing up. And so, you could think, yeah, setting a city up this way is part of what educates people into being good citizens, into being good people. And there may even be more things to say about the role of education in the assembly and in the law courts. They're the specific things that happen. There may be reason to call them educated. So anyway, I would encourage you to think about Melitus's answers there, which, as I said, I don't think he could develop much further, but somebody maybe could. Maybe we could. But then I want to look at one more. So Socrates says, then what about the listeners? And he says, well, maybe all the Athenians do. Well, is there a sense in which all of the Athenians might be doing a good job of educating people? And again, I think there is a plausible answer, yes, there. And this is an answer that comes out in some of other of Plato's dialogues. Definitely in the dialogue called Alcibiades and the dialogue called Charmides, and there may be others. In both of those contexts, Socrates is having a conversation with someone, in the one case with a young man named Alcibiades, and in the other case with a young man named Charmides. And the, the issue is raised that these people learned how to speak Greek. And who they learn it from? Who was your teacher? Well, everybody. You learn it by growing up in the context of all these people doing it. And so you're sort of publicly educated into the language, and that language is a pretty big deal. Right? Learning a language, it's amazing the power it gives you, the power to say things, but it's also that power to say things is simultaneously the uh, ability to participate in that society. Right? So you think about what you learn in learning a language. It's a pretty big deal. Think about how you learn it. I'm sure at some point you take a grammar class or something like that, but that's not the core way you learn it, right? Mostly you kind of learn it from everybody. So, um, so Meletus's answers uh, um, for someone who's prepared to think about them, and Meletus probably is not that person himself. Meletus's answers actually suggest some pretty important thoughts about what is involved in education and the role these other things do play in shaping who a person is. But Socrates, as he goes on, he says that thing about the horse trainer and so on, and then right where I left off, he had said, "Tell me further, Melitus, whether it is this is at 25c. Tell me further, Melitus, whether it is better to dwell among upright citizens or villainous ones." So yeah, it may be the case that the citizens as a whole teach you how to speak Greek, right? There are certain things you might learn there, but um, actually there may be quite a few things you could learn, and you could think about what some of those are. But then you could say, but does it make a difference whether those are good people or bad people? And again, the answer is probably yes. And now we have already seen another answer to the question: what do you learn from everybody? You learn all those slanders against Socrates, right? Those old charges were things that you took up in your youth because they were just part of the atmosphere around you. You grew up hearing these things. Nobody challenged them, etc., etc. So what the very point of saying that there's no single individual you can point to from whom you learned this is the claim that this is something you learn by your participation in the popular world. This is something that everybody kind of taught you, and that's sort of how prejudice gets passed on. So there is a kind of learning that comes from just participation in the popular world. But it's not unambiguously good. It's great that you learn how to speak Greek. It's not great that you pick up all the prejudices of the Greek public, right? And even take it back to your family. Like, you can have better or worse parents, and so similarly, analogously, you can have a better or worse community, right? If you grow up in the context of bad people, probably you'll pick up some pretty bad things. You grow up in the context of good people, probably you'll pick up some pretty good things. So you kind of get the sense here then, even though Melitus doesn't have the intellectual wherewithal to put a claim like this together, through this exchange, you kind of get a sense of a whole structure of education. Like there's a layer of education that comes just through participation in the public world. The layer of education that comes through the laws, right? All these things do something. They all have a role to play, and those things should be taken account of when thinking about where people come from. But running through all of that is this kind of moral issue. What makes you good, and does it matter with whom you're doing this, and so on? And then there is both then this general issue of what it is to participate as one of the members of that city, that kind of generic thing, and what it is to be good as an individual and what it takes to form that. And Socrates says, that ultimately that thing is going to have a lot to do, presumably, with the specific people you deal with and how you deal with them. It's a very personal issue, and the personal kinds of relationships are probably going to matter a lot. Anyway, so I guess I want to do a couple of things there. I wanted to look at that first bit of the exchange with Melitus, um, to raise this issue of, what a charge is in the law court and how Melitus is handling that. I wanted to look at the specific way that in trying to answer a charge in a law court, Socrates is dealing with this. And then I also wanted to look at the kind of philosophical issues that are raised in this. Right? The law court is not a place to be having a philosophy class. So we can have a philosophy class, and we can, at leisure, think through all these different issues and work out all the implications and so on, and debate and disagree and imagine we're going to go do some further research and or whatever else, right? That's not for the law court. That's not what it's about. The law court was about this person saying you're guilty for these reasons, et cetera, et cetera. And so we need to ask, at the level of the law court, is Melitus living up to the demands of the role he has taken on for himself? Nobody put him up to that. He did it. And then we can say, how is Socrates living up to the role he has? He didn't take it on himself. He was forced into that role by Melitus making those charges. Was Socrates living up to that role? So Melitus is an accuser. Is he doing a competent job in taking up his accusations? I think the answer is no. What's Socrates doing in his defense? So the interesting thing that Socrates is doing in his defense is testing to see whether Melitus can stand up to his claims. It seems to me that in a law court, that's a pretty serious thing, like a proper thing. He's saying, you can't even make sense of the accusation you're making against me. And if that's right, then like it's kind of a formal approach. If that's right, then at a very formal level, like Melitus should get kicked out of here and say, like, you're not living up to the demands of the thing you got to do if you're going to bring a charge against someone. So I want you to notice that, right? Socrates doesn't here say, you accused me of corrupting the youth. I'm going to prove to you that I don't. He says, you accused me of corrupting the youth. You need to prove that you can make that charge work. And so he's defending himself by trying to show that Melitus cannot make a compelling charge. So now I want to talk about the next exchange, which is about these other claims that Socrates doesn't believe in the gods of the city and that he's introducing new spirits, new daimonia. Here again, I'll go over this a bit more quickly and sort of generally. Like here again, he says those two, maybe you would have been okay with one or the other of those charges, but you made those two charges. So the question is, can a person make both those charges? So, and Socrates basically tries to show that Melitus is basically contradicting himself, and he's saying, you don't believe in the gods, you do believe in the gods. And if that's the case, then the charge doesn't make sense. So it's not. So Socrates, in that sense, is saying it's not a matter of showing whether or not I believe in the gods. It's not a matter of showing whether or not I've introduced new divinities. It's a matter of you, Melitus, being able to make the thing you're saying even coherent. And the fact is, just on formal grounds, your charge doesn't even make sense. And so the basic thing he says is, he says, okay, are you saying I just don't believe in the gods in the city, or I don't believe in the gods at all? And then Melitus reverts to that. You do the things under the earth and in the sky, right? So he says, you don't believe in the gods at all. You just, and Socrates says, so that's Melitus's claim. Like, you are a total non-believer. And he says, and this fits with what I was saying about the reasons people criticize, the scientists. He's saying, you just believe in the earth and that the earth is a rock. So Socrates says, do you think I don't even believe that the sun and the moon are gods? And he says, yeah, you just think they're rocks or whatever. So he's saying, you're just one of those sciencey people who doesn't believe in the divinities. So there you see, as I said, the character of that sort of older prejudice coming out, and that accusation of philosophy. But then Socrates then says, he doesn't say I do believe in those things, but he says Uh, what are you saying? Uh, are you saying, do I not even believe then that sun and moon are gods as other human beings do? Right? And that's when Meletus says no. He thinks that Socrates declares that sun is stone and moon is earth. Right? So Socrates doesn't say he believes that, but he says, don't I believe that obvious thing? Like it's like um, he sort of he would lead a listener to think, oh, I guess he does, even though Socrates hasn't said he does. He hasn't done anything wrong, but he's saying, don't you think I have even this simple belief, right? Uh, and in doing that, he gets Meletus to accuse him again of saying that he believes something, and Socrates says that now you're saying something ridiculous. So Meletus says Socrates declares that, and Socrates says I have never declared that, although there is a person who famously did declare that, Anaxagoras, another philosopher, and everybody knows that. So everybody knows that the claim you're making about me, the thing you're saying I say, is just something that some other philosopher said, and you're just handing on that same old garbage. Um, but so, what he gets Meletus to do there is, again, show that his claims about Socrates are unfounded, not really relying on any serious evidence, and also to make this more universal claim. It's not just that he doesn't believe in the gods. So he doesn't believe in gods at all. That's what he's saying his claim really is. Socrates got him to do that. And Socrates never actually says he believes in the gods, but he also, in his words, sort of puts himself among those people and says, "Are you challenging this?" Um, so Socrates doesn't. Uh, yeah. So let's just leave there. Socrates doesn't himself officially position himself anywhere. But so Melitus has now shown that he doesn't know what he misrepresents what Socrates says, and Socrates, of course, anybody knows that that's wrong. But he's also made this universal claim: you do not believe in gods. So then Socrates says, well, you can't say that and also say that I'm introducing new ones, right? And he says, okay, you didn't say I introduced new gods. You said I introduced new daimonia, new spirits, new divinities. But what do we mean by spirits? We mean, part of the divine world. And so if you can't say I introduce new divinities without believing in the existence of what is divine. So you can't say that I believe in the existence of what is divine and don't believe in anything divine, right? So that's basically the structure of what he does there. And um, shows on the basis of some of Meletus's answers again that Meletus's charge doesn't make sense. So once again, Socrates hasn't given a kind of a positive answer to Meletus's charges. What he has done is demonstrate that Meletus has no business making those charges. Right? So the section after this, Socrates is going to answer those charges more directly, but not in direct words. Right? So in the first part, he said, "Here are the old accusations," and then he said, "Okay, what is the thing I really do that has led to those misrepresentative accusations?" Right? Those accusations are misrepresentations of something real. Here are the accusations. Here's what I really do. Same thing is going to happen here. These are the official charges that Meletus makes. And Socrates is going to go on in the next section to talk about what he really does. And we'll basically be able to see the same thing, that those charges may be wrong, but they do relate to what he does. And so in that later thing, Socrates is going to talk about this daimonia issue, and he's going to talk about his relation to the gods. And I guess he's going to talk about the issue of corrupting youth too. I have to think about that one. Probably he is. It comes up. It does come up. But in any case, Socrates is going to give a positive account of himself, but he's not going to give a positive account of himself on the terms that Meletus has tried to demand. And because, Socrates has tried to show that the terms on which Meletus demands this are not weighty, right? So he's trying to show that unsatisfactoriness of Meletus's claims on their own terms, and then he's going to go back and say, look, here's what the truth really is, without ever directly answering those questions. I want to make. I think I want to just quickly make one more point and then pack it in for here, and then move on to the next part. And this is just going back to the issue of corrupting youth. And he says, if I'm corrupting people, let's say you're right. If I'm corrupting people, do I do it voluntarily? And Melitus says yes. And Socrates there says that he doesn't think that makes sense either, right? That it doesn't make sense to say people do bad things or would do corruption voluntarily. And because he says, if you say I corrupt the youth, you're saying that I do that intentionally and voluntarily. You're saying I'm choosing to make my companions worse people. And I'd have to be an idiot to do that, because then I would be choosing to make an environment that's worse for me. I mean, that's roughly the thing he says. I think we probably will come back and talk about that a little bit, but the thing I want you to just have in your mind there is that issue of what it means to say that a person would choose to do bad. And I want to just identify three different senses to that, and I want you to notice the difference between them, because a thing that often happens is people conflate different senses of that, which is to say they start off their conversation meaning one thing, and the later part in their conversation they mean another one, right? So the law could say that something is bad. So yes, a person could choose to do something that is bad in the sense that they're doing something that is officially deemed bad. It's something different to say somebody is doing something that they actually believe to be bad. And Socrates' point sort of is, if you do the thing that's designated bad, well, at some level that's because you don't really think it is bad, right? You think it's the right thing to do. So in a sense, you think it's good. It's a good thing for you. Right? It could also be more though than just an issue of being designated bad. You could also think there are some things that really are bad, like people shouldn't do this, and you might choose to do it even though you think it really is bad, because you want to hurt yourself or something like that. Even there, though, there's kind of a meta level. Like, you think the good thing to do would be to do the bad thing. So I just want you to think about that issue that he raises around this issue of whether people corrupt voluntarily or not. I want you to think about the difference between something merely designated bad, something you really think is bad, and what it means for you to decide this is the thing I should do here. I'm using the word should to sort of bring a notion of good in there. I'd like you to think about those three different things. That's part of that, which is relevant to grappling with that exchange he has with Melitus, but I think it's also going to be quite relevant to some stuff that's going to come up later. So I just wanted to tag that without going through it right now. But anyway, that's a fairly quick look at those few pages of the exchange with Melitus, where I want you to think about the legitimacy or illegitimacy of Socrates' response as a way of dealing with a court charge. So the issue of how well Melitus and Socrates are handling the roles of accuser and defendant, and what it takes to deal with a formal charge. I want you to think about the weight of the claims involved there. What's involved in educating or corrupting the youth? This one I've just mentioned but not pursued. What's involved in doing bad, and the issue of what's involved in believing in the gods. We haven't really talked about that. But Socrates didn't really have to talk about it either here, because he just tried to get Melitus to contradict himself and so on. But I want you to think about those basic issues. And then I also want you to think, as I said, about the relationship between the things that Socrates does in that exchange and the things we talked about in the earlier sections of the speech. But so we'll go on next time now to look at the very substantial part that follows his exchange with Melitus, where Socrates really gives you his interpretation of himself. He's given you his biography, he's looked at these charges, and now he's going to say, here's what I really care about. That's what we'll do next time.